My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 32, and before you even ask, yes, I'm the kind of woman who remembers everything. Where I was when I first learned how to lie. The sound of my mother's perfume bottles clinking as she left for another business trip. The way my sister laughed when she thought she had won. I remember it all, like a film that never stops playing in my mind. But what happened last week, or as my mother coldly reminded me, last week, is something different. You see, I told her I was excited for my sister's wedding tomorrow. She looked up from her teacup, blinked once, and said in that detached voice of hers, "Evelyn, the wedding was last week." I felt my stomach drop into something cold and empty. She didn't even look guilty. She looked bored. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels, how far the echoes of betrayal can reach. And while you're here, rate this story when it ends. I need to know if you think I went too far or not far enough, because if I'm being honest, this wasn't an accident. Not really. My mother always had a way of orchestrating life to suit her favorite daughter, my sister, Claire. Claire, the golden girl, the one who never got her hands dirty but always took credit for everything shining around her. Growing up, I was the quiet one, the thinker. The one who noticed things others didn't, like how Mom always poured Claire's milk first, how Dad only hugged her before leaving for work, how even the family dog wagged its tail for her before me. I told myself those things didn't matter, that I'd make them proud someday. But life doesn't hand out trophies for endurance. It rewards manipulation. And by the time I learned that, it was already too late. Claire had everything, the house, the fiancé, the attention, while I had silence. And silence has a way of turning into something dangerous when you feed it too long. When I found out about the wedding, it wasn't through an invitation. It was through a photograph someone posted online. My mother, my father, Claire, and her perfect groom, all smiling under strings of white lights. It was captioned "A perfect day." I zoomed in on their faces frame by frame. I saw the curl of my mother's lips, the familiar pity she saved for me. And that's when the air left my lungs, not from shock, but from clarity. It wasn't just that I was forgotten. It was that they wanted me forgotten. They wanted to erase me from their picture-perfect narrative. So, I decided to return the favor. But unlike them, I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to be felt. I wanted them to hear my silence and mistake it for peace. Because peace is the last thing they'd ever have again. That I started small. A message from an unknown number sent to Claire's fiancé. "Are you sure you know everything about her?" Then a series of whispers to my mother's closest friends about old secrets, private affairs, debts she thought were buried. The dominoes began to fall faster than I expected. Within a week, Claire's perfect engagement started to fracture under doubt. My mother's reputation, her precious currency, began to erode in social circles she once ruled. And I didn't stop there. I wanted them to feel confusion. I wanted them to ask, why? I wanted them to look at one another and see strangers. Because that's how they made me feel my entire life, like a stranger in my own family. But here's the thing no one tells you about revenge. It doesn't come with satisfaction. It comes with control. Cold, precise, and intoxicating control. When my mother called me last night, her voice trembling for the first time in years, I knew it was working. She asked if I knew anything about these rumors. I told her no, of course not. My tone was even, calm, almost gentle. I told her I was excited for the wedding tomorrow. There was a pause, long and suffocating. Then she said, "Evelyn, the wedding was last week." That was the moment she realized I wasn't confused. I was reminding her. The silence that followed was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. You see, revenge isn't about destroying someone in one blow. It's about erasing their certainty, piece by piece, until they question their own reality. And as I hung up that call, I smiled. Because I knew, for the first time in my life, my mother finally understood what it felt like to be me. It's strange how quickly guilt turns into obsession once it settles in someone else's mind. After that call, I didn't sleep. Not because I felt any remorse. No, I was wide awake because I enjoyed the silence. The kind that sits heavy in your chest and reminds you that you're in control now. I watched the ceiling fan turn slow circles in the dark, and every rotation whispered, "They forgot you. They forgot you. They forgot you." I used to cry when those words echoed inside me. Now I let them feed me. I could picture my mother lying awake in that expensive house of hers, realizing that she no longer knew which way was up. The woman who planned every event, every photograph, every conversation, suddenly couldn't plan her next breath. That was my victory. That was my justice. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I think that's wrong. It's best served slow, with every detail carved out until your target doesn't even realize they're already bleeding. Tell me, where are you watching from? I want to know how far a single whisper of vengeance can travel. Would you have done the same in my place? The next morning, I received an email from an anonymous account. It was a single line: "You're not invisible anymore." My hands froze on the keyboard. For a second, I thought it was some twisted prank. Maybe someone had found out. But then I realized it could only be her. My sister, Claire. She had always been smarter than people gave her credit for. I could almost see her sitting in that immaculate kitchen, scrolling through her phone, piecing things together. I imagined her face tightening as she began to suspect that her own sister, the quiet one, the forgotten one, might be behind the slow unraveling of her perfect world. It made me smile, because that was the whole point. I didn't just want her to lose everything. I wanted her to know I was the one taking it from her, one precious piece at a time. A week passed before she finally reached out. Her message was simple: "Why are you doing this?" I didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, I forwarded her screenshots, her fiancé's messages with another woman, messages I had carefully fabricated using his old online data. It wasn't about truth anymore. It was about perception. The truth is fragile, easily replaced by the story people choose to believe. I watched her digital world collapse in real time, friends unfriending her fiancé blocking her picture-perfect posts suddenly disappearing. I could almost hear the shattering sound of her pride. And then came the message from my mother: "You've gone too far." I wanted to laugh. Too far? No, I was only getting started. That night, I drove past their house, the house I grew up in, the one they said I didn't deserve to inherit. The windows glowed faintly, like warm eyes trying to pierce the dark. I parked across the street and watched. I saw Claire pacing inside, phone pressed to her ear, crying. I saw my mother standing at the top of the stairs, frozen, pale. I want to get out, to walk up to the door and remind them that all of this, was what forgetting me cost them. But I stayed in the car. Control isn't about confrontation. It's about distance. They needed to fear what they couldn't touch. So I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow." And that word lingered, soft but heavy, because tomorrow wasn't just a day. Tomorrow was the next phase. I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and opened a new document on my laptop. The file was titled "The Carter Family Legacy." Inside, I began to write every detail of my childhood, every slight, every lie. But the story wasn't for the world. It was for them. I wanted to send it anonymously, printed, bound, delivered straight to their doorstep. Each chapter ending with one message: "You made me invisible. Now you see me." I typed until the sun rose, until my fingers trembled, until my reflection in the laptop screen looked like someone I didn't recognize. Calm, detached, powerful. I didn't even notice the tears rolling down my face until they hit the keyboard. They weren't tears of sadness. They were the body's last attempt to feel something human before surrendering completely to the cold. I moved with the patience of a predator that knows the exact rhythm of its prey's heart. If they had always been careless with me, I would become meticulous in return. The printed, bound copy of the Carter family legacy arrived on their doorstep the next morning, wrapped in plain brown paper and slipped under the mat, so that when my mother found it, she thought the postman had made a mistake. She opened it with the kind of hesitant curiosity only people who have something to hide can muster. I imagine her hands trembling as she read the first page where I catalogued, in clinical, unadorned sentences, the small cruelties that had composed my childhood, the dinners where I was forgotten, the scholarships given to Claire but never to me, the holidays I spent empty-handed while the rest of them posed for warm holiday photos. I didn't dramatize. I simply presented facts, dates, receipts, and private memories framed like evidence. Documents I'd obtained quietly, an old prom invitation with my name missing that should have been in a family album, a charity donation receipt that proved my mother's public generosity had always come with strings attached, all of it arranged so that anyone reading would feel the slow, inexorable logic of betrayal. I didn't send it with malice-laced flourishes. I sent it like a scientist reporting results. That was the point. I didn't want noise. I wanted truth to ring out louder than any scream. The book did its work. Friendship groups fractured. Women who once accepted Mom's staged sympathy now called and asked questions, their voices edged with incredulity. I watched from afar as my sister's life began to wobble. It wasn't dramatic at first. There were missed brunches, curt messages, polite distance, but each small fracture widened into a canyon. I engineered some of those fractures. A wrongly addressed email here, a misdelivered text there. I hired a discreet private investigator to dig into the fiancé's past and found what I needed: small lies, a history of emotional flakiness, a pattern of favoring convenience over commitment. I didn't publicize it. I fed it into the places where people whispered, private group chats, a trusted friend of a friend who happened to know a cousin of Claire's wedding planner. Let the rumor mill do the uglier work. My role was to be the plausible origin of every doubt without being seen. Psychological revenge isn't loud. It's a fog that creeps into decision-making and smothers certainty. I watched certainty suffocate, and in that watching I tasted something like power. Sometimes I left breadcrumbs visible enough to be found. An anonymous voicemail on Claire's phone, a voice synthesized just like a stranger's, but seeded with detail only a close observer would know. Ask him about the nights he's not home. A luxury gift returned anonymously with a note. Does this replace what you lost? It would have been easy for them to dismiss these as pranks. That was why I always made sure to pair them with verifiable facts. A photo from an old junior high yearbook of my father with his arm around a woman I'd never known. An offhand comment from a former family friend who hadn't been seen in years, but suddenly posted a memory tagged with my mother's maiden name. The house became a place where the floorboards creaked with suspicion. At family gatherings, conversations turned clipped and cautious. Everyone checking their phones, everyone mindful of who might overhear. They asked each other softer questions, the kinds that can't be answered with rehearsed niceties. Do you really know Claire? Someone would whisper. Is everything as it seems? Those tiny questions multiplied until a single doubt had replaced the entire foundation of their assumed security. I took special care with my mother. She'd always relied on image, the polished veneer of social capital that could be rebuilt with one dinner or a generous check. I attacked that image not by exposing financial failure, but by contaminating the story she sold. An old employee, quietly nudged, began to talk about unpaid wages during a time when my mother hosted charity galas. A volunteer at the nonprofit she loved to mention in interviews suddenly remembered a dismissed complaint against her leadership. Each whisper recalibrated how people measured her. She moved through the world like someone wearing a coat stitched together from lies. When the first seam came loose, the rest followed. I never met them. I never shouted my truth. I let the truths I fed to the world do the shouting for me. And as they scrambled to gather their reputation like scattered cards, they glanced up sometimes, as if searching for the person who had set it all in motion. They never saw me. That was the sweetest part, but if you think I was satisfied watching them stumble, you don't know the last part of my plan. I saved the most intimate fracture for a night when the house would be full of their chosen allies. A family celebration rebuilt hastily after Claire's public doubts began. A small gathering to reassure social circles that everything was fine. I RSVP'd as a polite, anonymous presence, a donor's daughter with a plausible name, someone whose face none of them would remember, but whose presence could be arranged. I would not roar into the room. I would be a breeze that closed the windows. When the time came, I would take a step that would feel like betrayal carved into paper, something so mundane yet so precise that it would undo the last confidence they had. And then, when they were left with nothing solid to stand on, I would move closer, not to gloat, but to watch them try to remember who they once were without the story they had told themselves. The night I walked into their house disguised as a polite, forgettable guest, I felt no tremor of excitement, only the steady beat of preparation finally meeting opportunity. I had practiced the gait of someone unremarkable for weeks, the casual smile, the neutral gulp of wine, the half-heard laugh at the right intervals. My appearance was a study in anonymity, soft sweater, simple hair, nothing that would anchor memory. They welcomed me with the kind of brittle politeness you give to acquaintances whose faces you will forget by morning. That was exactly how I wanted it. I hadn't come to stir a scene. I'd come to hand them a mirror so subtle they would mistake the reflection for coincidence. The living room smelled of expensive candles and forced reconciliation. Claire sat near the hearth, cheeks flushed from nervous laughter, scanning the room as if waiting for approval to return. My mother floated through the crowd, practiced hostess smiles pasted in place, her fingers busy straightening napkins as if that small control could reset everything. I moved with slow, deliberate ease, offering a small compliment to the host, a murmured sympathy to an elderly aunt who'd once overlooked me, and a quiet, almost accidental shoulder brush past my sister that left a single, folded envelope tucked into the pocket of her coat without anyone noticing. It was elegant misdirection, something a careful hand could do while conversation masked its truth. Later, as the clinking of cutlery softened and the host rose to propose a toast to family and new beginnings, Claire pulled the envelope from her pocket in front of everyone. Her fingers trembled. The room stilled. The envelope contained copies, every receipt, every email, every polite note I had gathered and arranged, not in the accusatory tone of my book, but in the bland, incontrovertible language of evidence, a list of transfers that showed my mother's donations tied to contracts that enriched people close to her, a photograph from a vacation where Claire and a man identified as family friend were seated far too close under ambiguous circumstances, a voicemail from my father, years old, where his warm voice confessed something that made my mother's smile drop like a stage prop. No one screamed. No one stood. That was the point. The collapse I engineered was a slow, internal falling. Look how fragile dignity is when the scaffolding supporting it is quietly removed. Faces shifted from color to the drained gray of disbelief. Conversations ceased mid-sentence as guests scrolled their phones, reading, connecting dots that should never have been connectable. I watched my mother go pale first, a paper-thin mask of control cracking along the cheekbones. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. She tried to laugh it off, to call it a misunderstanding, but the room no longer accepted reassurances. It accepted facts. People began to murmur, soft at first, then louder, names that had been safe suddenly pronounced like accusations. Someone asked, "Where did these come from?" And in that second, my presence felt enormous and slight at once. Enormous because I had set everything in motion, slight because I remained a ghost in the periphery, a woman whose eyes could watch the slow unraveling of an entire life without having to touch it. I wanted them to look for me, to feel the itch that someone had rearranged the furniture of their certainty. Instead, they clutched at each other, eyes darting for an explanation that never came, fingers pointing at devices, at envelopes, at one another. My mother made a sound that was almost a laugh, too high, too brittle, then fled to the bathroom. Claire's fiancé fumbled for his phone, then denied everything with the practiced indignation of someone caught between panic and calculation. I stayed until the night thinned into small clusters of whispered conversations, and people slipped out into the cold believing the party was merely over. When the last guest left, I did not follow. I waited in the car across the street as headlights disappeared down the boulevard, and I watched them move through the house like guests in someone else's tragedy. My tragedy, perhaps, but theirs in the telling. I knew in that watchful hour that my act had done what I intended. It had shifted their internal weather. Now storms would arrive in small, persistent leaks, an estranged friend calling with pointed questions, a donor quietly withdrawing support, a contractor rebuking them in public. Control had been taken from them not with a shout but with a whisper of truth. And in the hush that followed, I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction, feeling nothing like triumph, only the cold, clean certainty that they would never again move through life assuming they were uncontested. When the dust settled and the days folded into one another, the change in my family was not cinematic, it was subterranean, a slow erosion that hollowed them out from the inside. My mother's invitations stopped coming. The luncheon circles that had once applauded her every anecdote cooled into silence. Donations that had bought her influence evaporated. Board members who had smiled in her portrait now answered politely and then excused themselves. Claire's world contracted. The fiancé who had once been eager to parade their perfection began to avoid the home, then stayed out later, then stopped answering entirely. He did not explode in scandal. He retreated into the small, tidy denial that had always comforted him, and that, more than any public ruin, was poison. Friends who had feigned loyalty slipped away when asked for statements, for support, for solidarity. Excuses arrived like winter birds, sudden and unreturning. Their reputations were not burned in a day, but corrosion is more effective than flame. Confidence leaked out of them, one inconvenient fact at a time, until they were surrounded by people who were polite but distant, curious but careful, and those are the worst eyes to live under, the ones that keep tally. I watched all of this with the cold patience of someone who had learned how to wait, but the victory I expected was different from the reality I felt. The house they had built from performance and charm became a quiet map of margins. Rooms that used to vibrate with laughter were still and suspicious. At first, I wanted to catalog each small victory like trophies. The way my mother flinched at the doorbell now, the way Claire's smile caught on edges and never reached her eyes. But the human heart is a slippery thing. Power can morph into loneliness. Control can harden into a kind of exile. One evening, 3 months after the envelope on Claire's coat, I received a message that made me pause. Not a triumphalist note, not a plea, but a single line from my mother. Come home. It arrived with a gravity that opened a fissure I hadn't expected. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. The voice that had once told me to be small now asked me to return. The woman who had orchestrated my abandonment was offering a palm for reconciliation or perhaps an attempt at repair. I could have walked back through the front door, placed the bound book on her mahogany table, and watched her face rearrange itself into rueful apology. I could have demanded tears, explanations, a public confession staged for the neighbors' benefit. Instead, I did something colder. I drove past the house at midnight, headlights off, and watched from the shadowed curb as a light burned in the kitchen like an accusation. I saw my mother at the sink, hands clenched around a mug, shoulders taut, and for a second she looked exactly like the frightened woman whose hand had slipped into mine the day I'd been small and scraped, the woman who had once tucked my hair behind my ear when the world felt too sharp. I imagined stepping in and ripping open the bandage, making the wound visible so everyone could see how it festered. But the point of what I had done was not to make them suffer in spectacle, it was to fracture their certainty until their own lives became foreign. Justice, for me, was not catharsis, it was the reclamation of a self they had tried to erase. So I sent one last anonymous package, a small, plain envelope containing nothing but a photograph of the three of us as children, my mother's hand on mine, Claire's grin wide and unguarded, and on the back, a single sentence in my handwriting: "You taught me how to be unseen. I taught you how to be seen." It was not revenge in the form of ruin. It was an index card of memory, a mirror held up to their faces, so they might know the truth I had lived with for decades. The next morning my mother called, voice raw and foolishly human, and for the first time she stumbled through questions that did not seek to defend herself, but to understand. Why? How could you do this? Weren't you my daughter? I sat with a phone in my palm, the city humming beneath me, and felt the thin line between triumph and despair blur. I told her, finally, in a voice that did not seek to wound but to close a ledger, that I had done it because she had taught me that being visible only came at the cost of someone else's invisibility. I told her that I had wanted them to taste the unease I had swallowed for years, to hear their own names spoken in the hush they had reserved for me. She wept in a way that was not performance. She wept for the first time at the sight of what her life had cost. Claire never asked to come back, and I never gave her the satisfaction. In the months that followed, my life grew quieter in another sense. I found myself walking different streets, taking work that did not answer to the old prestige, building small alliances with people whose loyalty was not transactional. There was no grand vindication, no public smear, no dramatic courtroom reveal, because the kind of vengeance I chose was not designed for applause. It was designed to alter the inner weather of those who had prospered on my erasure, so they would no longer be able to move through the world with their heads held unexamined. And yet, in the stillness after the storms, I learned a humbling truth. In reclaiming my visibility, I had also become an architect of loneliness. Power had a cost. The final, most private victory was bittersweet. They remembered me, truly, and in remembering they also remembered everything they had done. For me, that was enough. I let them live with a new discomfort. I let myself live with the knowledge that I had turned my silence into a weapon. It kept me awake sometimes at night, not from regret exactly, but from the raw awareness that the person I had become could be either healer or destroyer, depending on where I pointed her calm. So I chose something less absolute. I continued to watch from the distance I had learned to love. I reclaimed small joys that had nothing to do with their approval, and on Sundays I sent a bouquet anonymously to the elderly aunt who had once smiled at me when no one else did. The revenge had been cold, surgical, and complete, and in its aftermath, I learned to be content with a life that no longer depended on them to be real.